Colleagues and friends, we thought we'd begin with where it all started, the FCTC negotiations and what it was like for our African sisters in that sphere of very challenging debates. To do this, I will turn to my dear colleague, Patricia Lambert. Patricia, you were present from the very beginning of the FCTC treaty. You are South African, a human rights lawyer and social justice advocate. You were the head of delegation for the South African government at the treaty negotiations. You have led the International Legal Consortium, which we all refer to as ILC, at the Campaign for Tobacco for Kids, helping countries around the globe with their laws. And I hope you don't mind me mentioning here that the ILC is coincidentally and interestingly enough for today's topic, a team that's led by a woman and predominantly constituted of women. Excellent. So, Patricia, you have often reminded me that the African bloc was probably the force behind the final draft of the treaty negotiation and strong positions contained in it. Tell us why, and as you do that, would you share one of the most memorable moments you have about working with other female members in that African bloc? What were they like? How did they contribute to that success? Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Bintu, and good morning, everyone. It's an enormous honor to be here today in the company of so many amazing women. Bintu, the FCTC negotiations. Well, I do think that Africa is responsible for delivering the strongest treaty that we were able to get out of the negotiations. The treaty isn't perfect, but the negotiations were long and hard, and there were formidable forces from high-income countries that wanted to weaken the treaty to make sure that it was effective only insofar as they could not prevent that effectiveness. The African bloc has a history in this treaty, and I believe that it's a history that has not been had not happened before in UN negotiations. The very first negotiations that were held in Geneva, Switzerland, there was an Afro team meeting, and it was very clear at that Afro team meeting that most of the African delegations had little or no knowledge of what was going to go into the treaty, and there were only 2 lawyers in the room. So we turned to women's leadership. We turned to the Minister of Health for South Africa, and we asked her if she would host a meeting on African soil for the African delegates to the convention negotiations. She agreed to do that with funding from the WHO. What was amazing about that meeting was that the moment that we were on African soil, we related to one another differently, and at the end of that meeting, we decided to speak with one voice. And this is the aspect that has not occurred before in any international negotiations. So when we returned to Geneva for the second set of negotiations, Africa spoke with one voice. We met on African soil between the meetings. We agreed what our positions were. We ironed out our differences. And so many of those delegates over the 3-year period were led by women. So we had 2 very powerful women ministers in South Africa and in Senegal, ministers of health, and increasingly the delegations of governments were led by women. South Africa's delegation was led entirely by women, by Daisy Mafubedu, our health attaché, by Zanele Mthembu from South Africa, and by myself. And I have to tell you that it was enormous fun. And there were a lot of sort of jokes against the men that we passed around amongst us as they became more stubborn. And I was asked in preparation for this meeting to try to remember a story, and I do. So every single morning at 7, 2 hours before the treaty negotiations began in Geneva, the African group would meet. to make sure that we understood what would happen that day, to make sure that if we needed to renegotiate our positions, we had the space to do it. So we needed a Francophone leader and an African leader for that. And an English-speaking leader for that. So our English-speaking leader for the meetings was Daisy Mafubedu, the health attaché from South Africa. And for the Francophone countries, our leader was Mr. Andre Bass from Senegal. He too had a female Minister of Health. And so we would meet every morning at 7, we would meet at lunchtime, and we would meet again at the end of the day. This added about 5 hours to what was already a long day, but we had to keep together. And the investment in keeping together is what made us so strong as the African bloc. And it made the other low and middle income country blocs approach the African bloc, so that by the end of the negotiations, we were all standing together, the low and middle income countries. And that is how we managed to defeat the positions of China, Japan, Germany, the United States, the countries that were representing the tobacco industry loudly and clearly. So towards the end of the negotiations, when things were very heated, a number of the women had gone for lunch in the cafeteria just to let off steam, the African women. And we were chatting at the table, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Andre Bass, who was the joint leader of the African group, was sitting by himself having lunch. And I saw this little delegation of people from high-income countries, all men, who came to talk to him. And I saw him shaking his head. And then he said, no, quite loudly. And then when they had left, he came over to the table where the women were having lunch. And he said, oh, Patricia, Daisy, ladies, you will never believe this. They have asked me if I could keep my women in check.
Wow.
And there was an updrawing of breath from all the women having lunch at the table. And he said to them, no, I cannot do that. He said, if you want leadership, you look to these women. And if you want to keep them in check, go and talk to them yourself. They will tell you which door to use for your exit.
What a wise man. We stand up for him. I mean, how could all men think that one man could pull all those women aside, right, as a bloc? Congratulations to him. But Patricia, thank you so much for sharing those memorable stories. And again, all the hard work that needs to be done in unison behind the scenes. And so great to hear that most of it was coordinated by women. I'm not surprised. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.